On the morning of March 20th, 1906, the modern steel of the Walnut Street Bridge in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was host to a medieval horror. Dangling from a thick rope tied to a girder was the body of a man riddled with bullet holes, a silent silhouette against the rising sun. This wasn't a secret crime, hidden in the shadows. This was a public spectacle, a brutal message left for the entire city and the entire nation to see. The victim was a man named Ed Johnson, and just hours before his death, he had been granted a stay of execution by the United States Supreme Court. He was, by law, under federal protection. So what happened on that bridge? How could a mob tear a man from his cell and lynch him in open defiance of the highest court in the land? Today, we will answer that question. We will unravel a story of a city's rage, a sheriff's betrayal, and an injustice so profound it sparked an unprecedented legal battle for the very soul of America. Before he was a name in a Supreme Court case, Ed Johnson was just a man trying to find his way. He was 24 years old, a handyman, and a member of the Second Baptist Church. He wasn't a troublemaker. By all accounts, he was quiet, unassuming, and known for his steady work. In the segregated world of 1906 Chattanooga, a city trying to brand itself as a progressive hub of the New South, men like Ed Johnson lived a precarious existence. They were the backbone of the city's labor force, yet they were afforded none of its protections and lived under the constant unspoken threat of a racial hierarchy enforced by both law and tradition. His world was one of separate entrances, separate water fountains, and a carefully maintained social distance. He had hopes and fears like any other man, but his were filtered through the lens of Jim Crow. He sought stability, a bit of peace, and the quiet dignity of a life well lived within the narrow confines society had drawn for him. He was, in short, an ordinary man, which made him the perfect blank canvas onto which a city could project its deepest fears and hatreds. Miles away, in another part of that same city, lived Nevada Taylor. She was a young white woman, and her world was the mirror opposite of Ed Johnson's, defined by a different set of rigid expectations. Her life was meant to be one of protected virtue, of church socials, and a future promised within the safe confines of her community. She was a symbol of the Southern purity that the white power structure was obsessed with defending. The city they both called home, Chattanooga, was a place of deep contradictions. It boasted of its industry, its economic growth, and the grand Walnut Street Bridge that stitched the city together over the Tennessee River. But beneath this veneer of progress was a simmering cauldron of racial animosity. The memory of the Civil War was still fresh, and the rigid social order of the Jim Crow South was considered sacred. The slightest perceived transgression against that order, especially the ultimate taboo of a black man being accused of harming a white woman, was enough to make the city's civilized facade crumble into dust. In this tinderbox, Ed Johnson and Nevada Taylor were strangers, their lives running on parallel tracks that were never meant to intersect. But on a cold January night, in the darkness of a cemetery on the edge of town, those tracks would collide in a catastrophic event. One of them would become the victim of a brutal assault, and the other the victim of a city's ravenous, indiscriminate rage. Both of their lives and the world they knew were about to be destroyed. The crime scene was not a room with four walls, but a sprawling, cold expanse of earth and stone, the Forest Hills Cemetery. By day, it was a place of quiet reflection. But on the night of January 23, 1906, this sanctuary for the dead became a stage for a living nightmare. The air was still, the only sounds the rustle of winter leaves and the distant whistle of a train. It was in this profound and unnerving silence that Nevada Taylor was found, terrified and disoriented. There was no physical evidence to speak of, no footprints that could be trusted on the hard, cold ground, no discarded weapon, no clear signs of a struggle that told a specific story. The only evidence was Nevada Taylor's own harrowing account, a story pieced together from the fragments of trauma and the blackness of the night. She couldn't see her attacker's face. She couldn't describe his clothes. All she could offer was a voice in the dark and the terrifying assertion that her assailant was a black man. From the chaos, investigators clung to a single flimsy piece of information. Miss Taylor mentioned that she had grabbed at something during the attack, a small leather strap, which she thought might have come from her assailant's weapon. This tiny, ambiguous detail became the cornerstone of the entire investigation. It was not a clue that pointed to a specific person, but a desperate anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The scene of the crime quickly expanded beyond the cemetery gates and into the very heart of Chattanooga. Whispers turned to shouts, and fear curdled into rage. The city's white populace didn't see a mystery to be solved. They saw an outrage to be avenged. The lack of a clear suspect didn't inspire caution. Instead, it created a vacuum that was instantly filled with suspicion directed at every black man in the city. The investigation began not with a question, who did this, but with a conclusion. A black man was responsible, and he would be found. The wilderness of the cemetery had offered no easy answers, but the mob-minded certainty of the city demanded one, and it demanded one immediately. The hunt was on, not for a specific individual, but for any man who could be made to fit the crime. The city's fury needed a face, a name to attach to its collective rage. That pressure fell squarely on the shoulders of Hamilton County Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp. A man of his time and place, Shipp understood that justice in the Jim Crow South was often secondary to maintaining order, and order meant placating the white majority. His personal vendetta wasn't against any one man, but against the threat of chaos and the political damage an unsolved crime of this nature could do to his career. He needed a culprit, and he needed one fast. The investigation became a brutal dragnet. Deputies swept through the black neighborhoods of Chattanooga, rounding up men by the dozen. It wasn't about finding clues. It was about creating a lineup of potential sacrifices. And in this trawl, they found Ed Johnson. He wasn't caught red-handed, nor was he found with any incriminating evidence. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a known figure in the community who suddenly found himself ensnared in a nightmare. The flimsy clue of the leather strap was now given a purpose. A rumor began to circulate, likely started by the authorities themselves, that Johnson had been seen with a similar strap. It was a lie, but a powerful one. Suddenly, the community had something to latch onto. Ed Johnson fit the profile not because of evidence, but because he was available. He was a black man, he was young, and he was powerless. The entire weight of the investigation now shifted onto him. Every aspect of his quiet life was re-examined through a lens of presumed guilt. His unassuming nature was twisted into sullen secrecy, his work as a handyman seen as a cover for a darker character. The community didn't have a motive rooted in personal animosity, so they invented one for him. The racist, monstrous caricature of a black man driven by uncontrollable lust. A vile stereotype used for a century to justify racial violence. The mob had its villain. The Whispers had found their target. In the face of a lynch mob and a hostile legal system, a man has one last line of defense: his own lawyers. They are supposed to be his sword and his shield, the one party in the room bound by oath to fight for him, no matter the odds. For Ed Johnson, this sacred trust was placed in the hands of two court-appointed attorneys, W.G.M. Thomas and Robert Cameron. But this is where the story takes a chilling turn. The deepest betrayal wouldn't come from the mob in the streets, but from the very men sitting beside him at the defense table. There was no hidden affair or secret greed driving these men. Their motive was something far more common and far more poisonous. They simply did not believe their client was innocent. They were products of their time, white men of standing in a society that had already condemned Ed Johnson in its heart. To them, defending him was not a pursuit of justice, but an unpleasant professional obligation. A vigorous defense would mean alienating their peers, the judges, and the entire white community of Chattanooga. It was a battle they had no intention of fighting. Their actions in the courtroom, when re-examined, tell a story not of a failed defense, but of a defense that was never truly mounted. They met with Johnson only once, for a few minutes, before the trial began. They called no witnesses to the stand to testify to his character or to help establish an alibi. They offered only a timid, half-hearted cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses. The trial was a sham, and his own lawyers were willing participants in the charade. The final, damning proof of their betrayal came after the inevitable guilty verdict was handed down. Ed Johnson, terrified but resolute in his innocence, begged them to file an appeal. They refused. In their eyes, the case was closed. They had performed their duty as they saw it, and now they were washing their hands of the condemned man. This wasn't just legal malpractice, it was an act of profound abandonment. Ed Johnson's supposed guardians had delivered him, bound and gagged, to his executioners. He was utterly and completely alone. Just when Ed Johnson's fate seemed sealed, a new and unexpected force entered the fray. It did not come from within Chattanooga's white power structure, but from outside of it, from a quarter no one had bothered to consider. Two local black attorneys, Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, stepped out of the shadows. This was not just a legal maneuver, it was an act of almost unimaginable courage. In a city where they were considered second-class citizens, where their very ambition was seen as a provocation, they chose to stand up for a man everyone else had left for dead. Their motive was not profit or personal gain. It was a radical belief in the promise of American justice, even when America itself had broken that promise time and time again. They saw a sham trial, an innocent man railroaded, and a violation of the most basic constitutional rights. Their interest clashed directly with the unwritten law of the city, which demanded a swift execution to satisfy the mob. Pardon and Hutchins were not just fighting for Ed Johnson, they were challenging the entire corrupt edifice of Jim Crow justice. Their presence created an immediate and dangerous unease. They were threatened, intimidated, and ostracized. But they refused to back down. When the Tennessee Supreme Court slammed its doors in their face, they made a decision that would change legal history. They decided to appeal to an authority far outside the state, a power that the Chattanooga mob could not control, the Supreme Court of the United States. This was the ultimate external threat. The news that two black lawyers were taking their case to Washington, D.C. was seen as an outrageous act of defiance. To Sheriff Shipp and the city's leaders, this wasn't an appeal, it was an invasion. It was the federal government, the same force that had crushed the Confederacy 40 years prior, once again threatening to meddle in their affairs. The conflict was no longer just about Ed Johnson. It was a battle for control, a struggle between local mob rule and the supreme law of the land. The entire official investigation into the assault of Nevada Taylor was, from the very beginning, a grand and tragic false trail. The objective was never to find the truth, but to secure a conviction. The so-called clues that led to Ed Johnson were not discoveries, but constructions, red herrings deliberately laid to guide public opinion toward a predetermined conclusion. The central piece of evidence, the small leather strap, was the most potent of these fictions. Investigators treated it like a smoking gun, a direct link to Johnson, despite the fact that no one could ever definitively prove it belonged to him or that it was even connected to the crime. The trail led from this flimsy object to the Hamilton County Jail, where the most crucial piece of misdirection was staged. The identification of Ed Johnson by Nevada Taylor was not a moment of clarity, but of manufactured certainty. She was brought into a dim room where Johnson was the only suspect presented. Her initial hesitation, her uncertainty, was brushed aside by the forceful suggestions of the lawmen around her. Under immense pressure, she gave them the identification they wanted. This shaky, coerced statement, which should have been a dead end, was instead treated as an irrefutable fact. Meanwhile, any path that might have led to the truth was quickly blocked off. Ed Johnson had an alibi. Witnesses in the black community could place him at a saloon far from the cemetery at the time of the attack. But these leads, The only ones that actually pointed toward his innocence were never pursued. The authorities simply weren't interested. Every testament to Johnson's good character, every inconsistency in the timeline, was ignored. These promising trails didn't evaporate. They were deliberately buried under the weight of the official narrative. This created a strange and dangerous kind of frustration. For Sheriff Shipp and the white mob, the frustration wasn't that the case was stalled, but that the legal process, however flawed, was taking too long. They had their man, their simple answer, and the appeals filed by Pardon and Hutchins were seen as infuriating obstacles. For the black community, the feeling was one of growing terror. They were watching a legal system actively lead itself down a false path, and they knew that at the end of this trail lay not justice, but a hangman's noose for an innocent man. In Chattanooga, the truth was not buried by a lack of evidence, but by two formidable walls of silence. The first was a wall built by the white community, not of quiet whispers, but of a deafening, unified roar. It was an unspoken agreement that Ed Johnson was guilty, a conclusion reached before the trial even began. This wasn't just about one crime, it was about defending a fragile social order. To question Johnson's guilt was to question the very foundation of their world, to suggest a white woman could be wrong and a black man could be innocent. Any white person who harbored doubts learned quickly to keep them to themselves, lest they be branded a sympathizer, a traitor to their own. The second wall was built by the black community, and it was a wall of pure, unadulterated terror. People knew Ed Johnson. They knew his character. Some even knew where he was on that fateful night. But the code of the Jim Crow South was brutally simple. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, and you knew nothing that contradicted the white mob. To come forward as an alibi witness for Johnson would not have been seen as a civic duty, but as an act of suicidal defiance. The price for speaking the truth was the firebombing of your home, the destruction of your business, or a rope thrown over a tree limb with your own name on it. This silence was born from a deep and justified distrust of the law. The police and the courts were not seen as protectors, but as the enforcement arm of the white power structure. To go to Sheriff Shipp with information proving Johnson's innocence would be pointless and perilous. The system was not designed to find the truth. It was designed to produce a result, and that result had already been decided. The psychological toll on those who dared to breach this wall was immediate and severe. Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins were the ultimate examples. By taking Johnson's case, they shattered the silence. In return, they were marked men. Their lives were openly threatened, their reputations dragged through the mud. They were hunted in their own city, forced to flee for their very survival. The message sent to the rest of the community was chillingly clear. This is the fate of those who speak. After that, the silence became absolute. With the Tennessee courts turning a deaf ear and the execution date looming, all hope seemed to be lost. The legal road had run out, and the gallows were being prepared. But in the small office of Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, a discovery was made that would change the course of American legal history. The forgotten clue they unearthed wasn't a misplaced letter or a hidden diary. It was a fundamental principle that the state of Tennessee had chosen to ignore. It was the United States Constitution. Their argument was as simple as it was revolutionary. They contended that Ed Johnson had not received a trial by a jury of his peers, but had been condemned by a jury of intimidated hostages. A courtroom surrounded by an armed, bloodthirsty mob, they argued, is not a court of law. It is a stage for a legal lynching. This was not a failure of evidence, but a failure of the entire process, a gross violation of Johnson's right to due process under the 14th Amendment. This was their forgotten clue. The trial itself was the crime. With this powerful argument, they did the unthinkable. They bypassed the entire state judicial system and took their appeal directly to the highest court in the land. It was a desperate, audacious gamble, two lone black lawyers from the South petitioning the 9 most powerful jurists in America. And then, the impossible happened. The Supreme Court listened. Justice John Marshall Harlan, a man who had famously dissented in the Plessy versus Ferguson case that enshrined separate but equal, saw the profound injustice. On March 19, 1906, he granted a stay of execution. A telegram was dispatched from Washington, D.C. to Chattanooga. It was a single piece of paper, but it carried the full weight of the United States government, ordering a halt to the execution. The forgotten clue had not just opened a door, it had kicked it off its hinges. For a fleeting, miraculous moment, the law had prevailed. The case was no longer about one man's life. It was now a direct confrontation between the rule of law and the rule of the mob. The telegram from the Supreme Court should have been a shield, an impenetrable barrier of federal authority protecting Ed Johnson. Instead, in the charged atmosphere of Chattanooga, it acted like a lit match tossed into a powder keg. The news spread through the city not as a call for lawful patience, but as an intolerable insult. A distant court in Washington, they felt, had stolen their justice, robbing them of the vengeance they so desperately craved. The city began to simmer, and then to boil. The central mystery was no longer who attacked Nevada Taylor, but who would dare to defy the United States Supreme Court. The answer was not some shadowy figure hiding in the back alleys. The mastermind of the lynching, the man who held the keys to both the jail and to the mob's fury, was Hamilton County Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp. His unmasking came not from a forgotten clue, but from his own deliberate, chilling actions on the night of March 19th. His motive was a toxic cocktail of wounded pride, political calculation, and pure racist ideology. The Supreme Court's stay of execution was a direct and public humiliation. It was a declaration that he, the sheriff, had overseen a failed and unconstitutional trial. In his mind, his authority, his honor, and the honor of his community had been trampled by an interfering federal power. Faced with a choice between his oath to uphold the law of the land and his allegiance to the unwritten code of the mob, Sheriff Shipp made his decision. He would side with the mob. The unmasking is found in the sequence of his orders that night. First, he sent the vast majority of his deputies home, leaving the county jail, which held a man now at the center of a national firestorm, almost completely unguarded. Then, he personally disarmed the one remaining jailer, a man named Nicholson, leaving him with only a single, useless key. He had effectively laid out a welcome mat for the violence he knew was coming. The mob that gathered that night was not a spontaneous eruption of chaos. It was an organized force, its leaders emboldened by the silent, implicit permission of the sheriff. They marched on the jail, not with the uncertainty of a riot, but with the confidence of men who knew they would face no resistance. When the sledgehammers began to ring against the jailhouse doors, the sound was not just breaking steel, but the shattering of the rule of law. The true culprits were unmasked, a furious mob acting as the fist, and the county sheriff, the man sworn to stop them, acting as the calculating, treacherous mind. The night air of Chattanooga filled with the rhythmic, brutal clang of steel on steel as the mob's sledgehammers beat against the jailhouse doors. Inside, a terrified Ed Johnson listened as his last line of defense was systematically battered into submission. When the doors finally gave way, a river of angry shouts and menacing faces flooded the corridor. Rough hands seized him, dragging him from the relative safety of his cell out into the cold March street. They marched him through the city, a grim procession lit by flickering torches and street lamps. The mob was a beast with 100 heads, and it was parading its victim towards the altar of its rage, the Walnut Street Bridge. The modern steel structure, a symbol of Chattanooga's progress, became a stage for its most medieval impulse. The dark, swirling waters of the Tennessee River flowed silently below, an indifferent witness to the horror about to unfold. On the bridge, under the vast, starless sky, a thick rope was thrown over a steel girder. In this final, terrifying moment, Ed Johnson was granted a chance to speak. His voice, clear and steady, cut through the jeers of the crowd. He did not beg for his life. He proclaimed his truth. "I am an innocent man, he declared to the faces surrounding him. "I am not guilty of this crime. I have said it all the time and I say it now. God bless you all. I am ready to go." Then he was pushed into the void. The rope snapped taut, but the fall did not bring a swift end. As his body twisted in the air, a leader of the mob raised a pistol. A single sharp crack echoed across the river, and Johnson's body went limp. It was followed by another and another. From the bridge above, a fusillade of gunfire erupted. The night was filled with muzzle flashes, each bright spark followed by the sound of a shot. Over 50 in all, each one a punctuation mark in a statement of pure defiance. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. A ringing silence descended upon the bridge, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the steel girders and the distant bark of a dog. Ed Johnson's body hung motionless, a haunting pendulum suspended between the city and the dark river below. The mob, its terrible work done, quietly began to disperse, leaving their gruesome message hanging in the night for all the world to see. News of the lynching in Chattanooga was not just news of a murder, it was news of a rebellion. The mob, aided by the sheriff, had not just killed a man, they had openly defied a direct order from the United States Supreme Court. The insult was so profound, so audacious, that it shook the halls of power in Washington. President Theodore Roosevelt himself condemned it as a hideous crime. The Supreme Court, its authority fundamentally challenged, decided to do something it had never done before and has never done since. It resolved to hold its own criminal trial. The atmosphere was unlike any other in American history. The case of United States versus Shipp was not held in a Tennessee courthouse filled with angry locals, but before the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. The defendants, Sheriff Shipp and several leaders of the mob, were summoned to the nation's capital. They walked into the proceedings not with the demeanor of contrite men, but with a quiet, stubborn defiance. Back home, they were heroes who had upheld the Southern Code. In Washington, they were seen as insurrectionists. They were not on trial for murder. The federal court had no jurisdiction for that, but for something just as fundamental, contempt of court, for spitting in the face of the highest law in the land. Shipp and his men maintained their innocence, claiming they were simply overwhelmed by a spontaneous and uncontrollable mob. They presented themselves as hapless peacekeepers, not willing conspirators. But the evidence, painstakingly gathered by federal investigators, told a different story. A story of deputies sent home, of a jail left intentionally unguarded, of a sheriff who had promised the mob they would not be stopped. The verdict, when it finally came down in 1909, was a thunderclap. The Supreme Court of the United States found Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp and 5 of his associates guilty. It was a seismic moment, the first time the federal government had successfully prosecuted the participants of a lynch mob. But then came the sentence. For orchestrating the murder of a man under federal protection and for defying the highest court in the land, Sheriff Shipp was sentenced to serve just 60 days in a federal jail. Justice, it seemed, had been both served and denied in the very same breath. The verdict established a monumental precedent. The rule of law could and would reach down to challenge mob violence, but the punishment was so laughably light that it felt like a slap on the wrist. Shipp served his time and returned to Chattanooga not as a disgraced criminal, but as a celebrated martyr, his reputation enhanced by his brief and comfortable imprisonment. The verdict was a landmark victory for the principle of law, but a bitterly hollow one for the cause of true justice. The lives of everyone touched by the tragedy of Ed Johnson were permanently fractured, their futures sent spinning in new and often tragic directions. For the 2 men who fought for him, Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, the price of their courage was exile. They were hounded from the city they sought to better, their legal practices destroyed, and their lives under constant threat. They became fugitives from the very mob they had tried to defeat in a courtroom, forced to rebuild their lives in the anonymity of the North, their names whispered in Chattanooga's black community with a mixture of reverence and fear. They had won a moral victory, but suffered a devastating personal defeat. The opposite was true for Sheriff Joseph Shipp. He did not return from his 60-day sentence in shame. He was welcomed back to Chattanooga as a conquering hero. He walked the streets not as a convicted criminal who had defied the Supreme Court, but as a champion of Southern honor who had stood up to federal overreach. His complicity in the lynching did not end his career. It solidified his legacy among the white majority. He became a living symbol of the South's defiance, his life a testament to the fact that in the Jim Crow era, some crimes were not only tolerated, but celebrated. Nevada Taylor, the young woman whose assault was the catalyst for the entire nightmare, retreated into a life of quiet obscurity. The trauma of that night in the cemetery was compounded by the horror of what was done in her name. She never spoke publicly of the events again, living out her days in the long shadow of a crime she survived and a murder she inadvertently caused. Her life, like Johnson's, was irrevocably defined by that one terrible night. For the black community of Chattanooga, the lynching of Ed Johnson became a ghost story told for generations, a brutal lesson in the consequences of defiance. It cast a pall of fear that lingered for decades, reinforcing the city's rigid racial hierarchy with the haunting image of a body hanging from the Walnut Street Bridge. But a seed of resolve was also planted. The fight for Ed Johnson's name did not die with him. It was a slow, stubborn pursuit of justice that spanned nearly a century, a legal and moral reckoning passed down through the years, waiting for a time when the city would finally be forced to confront its past. If you walk across Chattanooga's Walnut Street Bridge today, you will see a city reborn. It is now a pedestrian walkway, a beautiful expanse of blue steel where families stroll, cyclists glide by, and tourists take photos of the Tennessee River below. It is a symbol of the city's vibrant present. But the steel beneath your feet tells a different story. The massive girders that support this scene of modern leisure are the very same girders from which a noose was hung in 1906. The bridge is not just a landmark, it is a monument to a murder, a tangible physical remnant of a night of profound horror. For nearly a century, the official story of Ed Johnson was a ghost, a tale whispered in the black community but largely erased from the city's public memory. But ghosts have a way of demanding to be seen. In the year 2000, 94 years after his death, the Hamilton County Court officially overturned Ed Johnson's conviction, a stunning and long overdue admission of the injustice that had been done. The echo of his last words, "I am an innocent man," had finally found its way back into a courtroom and been affirmed as truth. Today, not far from the foot of that very bridge, a new monument stands. It is the Ed Johnson Memorial, a solemn and powerful space dedicated to his memory and to the courage of Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins. It is a deliberate act of reclamation, a place where the story is no longer whispered but told in bronze and stone for all to see. It stands as a counter-narrative to the silence, a permanent testament to a history that the city is finally beginning to confront. The mountains that cradle Chattanooga have seen empires rise and fall, and the river has carried 1,000 secrets to the sea. They were the silent witnesses to the crime, the trial, and the lynching. For decades, the world tried to forget what happened on that bridge, to pave over the past with progress. But the steel remembers, the river remembers. And now, thanks to the tireless pursuit of justice, the city is finally being forced to remember too, ensuring that the echo of Ed Johnson's story will never again fade into silence. So we return to the question that hung in the air with Ed Johnson's body. How could this happen in open defiance of the nation's highest court? The answer, we now know, is as simple as it is terrifying. The law is not a fortress of stone. It is a fragile agreement, utterly dependent on the integrity of those sworn to uphold it. On that night in Chattanooga, the man with the badge decided the mob's will was more important than the court's word, and in that moment, the law ceased to exist. But this story is more than just a chronicle of a failure of justice. It is a profound lesson in the slow, stubborn, and often painful pursuit of it. It teaches us that the arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, as the saying goes, but it does not bend on its own. It must be pulled, inch by painful inch, by the hands of courageous and often forgotten people. Men like Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, who risked everything for a man they knew was innocent, pulled on that arc. Their fight seemed lost in 1906, but it started a conversation that refused to die, a quiet echo that grew louder with each passing generation. The story of Ed Johnson is a reminder that history is never truly in the past. It lives in the steel of a bridge, in the names carved on a memorial, and in the ongoing struggle to reconcile our ideals with our actions. The Supreme Court's verdict was a landmark for the rule of law, but the real justice, the clearing of an innocent man's name, took nearly a century to arrive. It is a story that teaches us that the loudest shouts for truth often come from the quietest graves. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. You know how the law can be both a shield and a sword, and how sometimes it is simply a whisper in a storm of rage. For the law can be written on paper, but justice must be carved into the heart of a community. And that is a task that is never truly finished.